Back in the land before time, when Santa Monica Studios set out to reboot their lauded God of War series after they finished Ascension, they must have had quite the quandary on their hands. What else can you do with Kratos after he finished his long-time revenge quest, gutted himself and fell off a mountain? What direction could the series have gone? What stories were there left to tell with this guy? And thankfully for the launch of the PS4, they were able to find one. Deciding to give up entirely on the plot of everything that came before, Kratos was handed an entirely new backstory after a big time gap that supplanted him in a completely new location. Since the Pantheon has been annihilated, Kratos was going to be set loose in the Norse world instead. Welcome to the Nine Kingdoms, everyone. It's time to put on a show. God of War 2016 is the true epitome of what it means to be an actual reboot. It's not simply ejecting the entire previous canon and making the first game again. No, this time it's a complete replacement of the themes and ideas of the previous canon while still keeping it as historical canon in Kratos' backstory that comes up throughout his journey. Before the events of this game, Kratos somehow managed to get his life together so much that he started a family with someone he met on the road. They led a humble life, eking out a living in a cabin in the woods, and eventually was graced with his son, Atreus. Unfortunately, the game begins with Kratos' wife having died, and so the pair go on an adventure to honor the fallen and scatter her ashes on a mountain a couple hundred miles away. Even though it's a reboot, the game still does have the old formula of the God of War series where you start out with this simple goal, and then through the puzzles, exploration, and combat, it ends up getting deeper and more complex as Kratos has to run headfirst into constant resistance in order to make his eventual way to point B. It's a classic road trip as Kratos begins prepping for him and his son to make the trip, only to be stopped by some random guy bashing on his front door. Obviously, the stranger is being annoying, so Kratos tells him to fuck off while being wary of not using his godly powers as to not draw attention to himself, since at this point he's basically a god-level war criminal. But circumstances change that forces his hand the second that this weedy-looking bum throws Kratos through a tree and begins the tutorial boss fight. The clash with the stranger shows that Santa Monica wasn't fucking around with their reboot as they built a multi-pronged cinematic encounter featuring QTE combat scenes, frequent camera shifts and close-ups, along with several long-string combat sections where you have to beat down the stranger's health bar in order to advance to the next part of the boss battle. It's the highly graphical, visceral combat that fans were hoping to see in Santa Monica's next-gen work, and they delivered on it beautifully, bringing you an excellent slice of what the rest of the game was going to be, along with teaching the player the new combat skills that they'll need in order to use that beatdown on the enemies with Kratos' new Leviathan Axe, a melee weapon that allows a ranged option that's good for regular combat and some additional puzzle mechanics. With Kratos having beaten on the stranger for a good long while and destroying half of the place where he used to live, he and Atreus begin their long trek through the wilderness. With the combat thoroughly introduced, we get to see the new addition to the God of War formula, and it is the change to add in a open world idea to the linear God of War formula. For the most part, the open world isn't awful. With detailed environments, Santa Monica definitely made it interesting to explore worlds since areas are well connected and yet completely different from each other and filled with unique details. But the problem is that God of War 2016 doesn't just use the open world to its fullest idea. Like Gears 5, they put in a small variety of side quests to do that's off the beaten path, and while they do have those interesting stories and characters that you're supposed to do with side quests, and the rewards that you get for doing them are actually pretty valuable, the problem is that side questing isn't a simple matter. Rather than going to a place where a bunch of people are and getting all the problems at once, to actually go get the side quests in this game, you have to drop whatever you're doing and specifically focus on doing one quest at a time from beginning to end, because the questing areas are far away from most of the main quest paths, so there's no ability for the player to easily switch between the main journey and going to do side quests. You have to choose to actively do one or the other, and since the RPG elements in this game are actually pretty light, the rewards for the side quests aren't actually vital to get through the main story for the most part. So, I'm gonna say that the side quests in the grand scheme of things just don't matter. They're not good enough to spend the energy on actively doing them, because, just hitting the baseline isn't really enough to stimulate the creative juices in the player. At the very least, Santa Monica put top priority on the main quest, so the deficiencies of the open world doesn't hamper the game at all that most players are actually here to see. It's just that the addition isn't as good as the developers probably hoped it would be. As we continue through the early stages of the game, you'll get acquainted with the different zones and the areas of the map, since they do go through each one in great detail. The world design isn't huge and empty like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but it's also kinda small for how quickly the terrain changes as you walk through it. Throughout these regions, the ancients who built the roads and passages included a host of weird door locks, switches, and traps for the player to parse, so that they can continue on their merry way. You get plenty of puzzle-solving tools at your disposal that also integrate into the combat, so that you have multiple uses for them, which allows for some creative answers to figure out, especially when you are given the chance to look for the hidden chests, which are included with the usual rage and HP upgrades that were kept from the original formula. These collectibles are a good mix of puzzles that aren't impossible to find in the first place, but can be pretty damned clever to find. Kratos can use a few items, movement abilities, and abilities of the Leviathan Axe to solve his way through the Norse world, along with commanding Atreus through a couple of his own abilities to get even more puzzle options out of him. Atreus' main use is that he's given a bow that he can use in puzzles and combat, and more often than not, Atreus is also good for getting small chip damage without you directing him all the time. His AI is actually pretty damn good at keeping itself in combat, but is just not that effective at all, and requires Kratos to finish off the enemies that he's engaging with. At the very least, there's tons of puzzles in this game. They're all integrated very well, and I appreciated getting to journey through them because it makes for an intricate and very imaginative journey. It's very linear without actually feeling like you're being boxed in by the game. So it's just a real good mix of a brand new world, great mechanics, and still keeping the formulaic things that the fans are here to see, while still implementing them in fantastic fashion. However, to be honest, I did have a few problems with the new combat model for God of War 2016 throughout the first half. A lot of the enemy attacks are in groups, and Kratos' battle style is built more for one-on-one fights, and this becomes especially true when flying enemies start coming into play and are able to charge in, do damage, and get out without the player really getting a good opportunity to counter it if they're fighting something else. The Leviathan Axe is good for one-on-one. You can throw it in order to get hits on multiple enemies, but like Atreus, the damage there is kinda minimal, and it doesn't stagger enemies, and that's actually kinda true for the regular combat as well. Kratos usually just doesn't stagger things like he should for a combat system that requires him to get in the fray and smash anybody that's unlucky enough to be in front of him. His attacks can go forward quite a lot, so you don't actually get all the options to hit multiple enemies at the same time without one possibly falling out of your combo and becoming a risk to you in the middle of your combo. They do hand you a shield to help with some of this, and it's a good combat tool. It's just not as good as it should be. It's good for ground-based enemies, but quite a bunch are flying chargers, which the shield just isn't good against. It's mostly there for enemies that are already in your face or projectiles, and since the shield is only partially effective, it's pretty easy to forget that it's there at all, and so you end up falling back on Kratos' special abilities, throwing the axe, or just simple light attack combos because those are more effective. He does have these heavy-hitting special moves, but they either come with weird caveats to their usefulness, or the cooldowns can be so high that they just become selectively useful. Some of my issues in this game are helped by Kratos being pretty tanky, but some of these encounters are designed to be right bastards if they get the proper enemies stacked together. I had quite a few failures throughout my playthrough, and I think that's partially because the combat seems to have been made clunkier, not as useful, and simply more annoying in general. In the first half, there's no one reliable tool for all encounters, which forces you to try and remember these multiple abilities in a pinch, and it's so much stuff to lumber on a player that it just becomes way too confusing for its own good, especially when I remember the great simplicity of the original trilogy's combat. AoE blades, brutal executions, and some magic spells were the perfect blend. God of War 2016's combat felt like they just threw in way too many ideas in the soup, and it just completely spoiled what they were trying to do with it. On the flip side, while this game might have a bit too many combat mechanics, thankfully Santa Monica decided to go with a small cast for this game because all of the side characters in this game are great to fantastic, bosses excluded. The Lady in the Woods is a complicated person who hosts great knowledge about the Norse world that she does want to help Kratos with when they eventually come to an understanding, mostly because the lady cares about Atreus, who naturally pals around with her because he's a little kid and she's being nice to him. There are two dwarves later on who are brothers that no longer work together. They are completely different and exactly as well done as each other. The first one is sweary, angry, loose-lipped, and takes great pride in his work, and the other one is snooty, orderly, and intricate designer and can't really deal with people questioning his work. The Stranger is a great villain with a tragic past, a relatable backstory that we learn throughout the journey, and even though he's also brutal and sadistic, I did like watching his scenes quite a bit because he gets very dramatic and unreasonably angry for a legitimate reason. There's an actual character arc and person there to watch. Later on, after a tale of despair, Kratos willingly acquires the head of Mimir, a long-forgotten immortal man with connections to Odin, having been punished for handing out royal secrets or something, and he is easily the star of the entire show. He has well-written comedic lines, his voice actor is doing the best job since he's been given the best material for his acting strengths. He has such great comedic timing, plus he's able to tell these vividly personal stories about the Norse gods that we don't actually see in the game, and the history of how and why they've been fucking with each other and humanity in all the 9 realms whenever they please. Every single boat ride in this game includes a unique anecdote from Mimir, and they're easily the best reason for wanting to stay in the boat. They gave him so much script to work with that I didn't encounter any repeat stories throughout my playthrough. Even the sea monster at the end of the game is a pretty good character, since he has huge ramifications for Kratos' journey, having so much control of the world around him, while not really having a grudge against him himself, and eventually he does want to help out when Mimir manages to decipher its language and figure out what it actually wants. There are more bosses beyond the Stranger, but they aren't really characters since they appear once, and we don't really get to learn anything about them other than they are mostly dicks who want to get in the way just because it's Kratos they're fucking with. Kratos tried to keep his head down, but quickly found out that wasn't going to happen due to how many Norse gods he had to talk to in order to continue along his journey. Well, we talked about something positive with this game, so let's go to the other side of the board for this one. One major problem with God of War 2016 is that the game is built around the double act of Kratos and Atreus, and their relationship is really bad for being main characters. The double act narrative is supposed to provide us with 2 characters that contrast with each other, and the pair do actually have that. Atreus is naturally naive, he lacks in knowledge, and has a lot of empathy towards everybody else, while Kratos knows too much, is incredibly cynical, closed off, angry, and very powerful. The central issue is that a character quirk they gave to Kratos is that he's constantly telling Atreus to obey him without question and stay in line, which means that for most of the game, Atreus isn't given that opportunity to talk without permission, so any serious character development we get for their relationship is pretty much saved for just a few select cutscenes, and it's not enough time to see the full scope of their personalities clashing and meshing together. Kratos wants their journey to mostly be a quiet affair, which ends up making the fact that it's a double act so much wasted potential. I simply got annoyed listening to Kratos telling his kid to shut up so many times because they were both interesting characters I wanted to know more about, and yet Kratos is spending so much of his energy shutting down chances for conversation that it's completely ridiculous. To be fair, they do have a few relatable father-son moments, such as Kratos explained to him why being quiet is important in his case specifically, the importance of patience in hunting, and they even have a drink together at one point. The problem again is that these instances are so rare in the game that they don't have much value when so much time is spent on deliberately shutting down these opportunities to get to know them better. This also doesn't help that Kratos' first interaction with any other character was to barely talk and try to get any business done with them immediately and move on. This attitude of no talking is such a confusing one to constantly see in a script that has so much detail, perspectives, and time spent on developing this fully realized world and its characters. Kratos is such a huge obstacle to all character development that it's quite strange for a game like this. Maybe that's why I like Mimir so much, is because he did actually have to be kept in line and could basically talk throughout most of the second half of the game whenever the hell he wanted, which provided so much more detail about the world around them. I know that the obvious detraction is going to be, well, Kratos doesn't want to talk to anybody or anything because he wants to keep his head down so that he doesn't anger Odin's family, but I think that if they're going to put so much effort into this game, they probably could have still written the script in a way to actually retain that idea while also still giving us chances to see his personality, rather than deciding to shut it completely down and not include anything about him. So after going through a ton of rigmarole to get to the tallest mountain in the land to scatter the ashes, there was a very clear middle split in the game when major things change. When Kratos eventually ascends that mountain and finds Mimir on top of it, he finds out from him that this mountain isn't actually the tallest. That claim goes to a mountain in the kingdom of the giants, which Odin has shut off from the rest of the 9 realms because of an earlier war between them and the Norse gods. Most of the bridges have been shut off from the giants' realm, but he does know where they can find another portal. This is the point when the idea of traveling between the realms becomes a part of the game, as new maps are unlocked to go to. Some of them are fully designed open worlds for Kratos to visit, but like the side quests, there are also a couple optional realms that barely have any level design to them if Kratos wants to go do that optional content. Personally, I would probably recommend against it because it's just kind of so-so. Even for how varied the first world map is, this was an addition that I loved since it allows the level design to vary even more and be more interesting, since each realm is completely unique and doesn't have to have that obligation of being a well-meshed world because they're basically different dimensions, so you can basically do whatever you want with them. And they definitely knocked it out of the park on making those worlds, because it's basically have the same value as the main one, it's just there's another 5 of them to explore and we're gonna have a good time in each one. After that revelation and the fact that Odin's family is learning more and more about his existence on their land, Kratos decides that it's time to return home and reclaim a lost memory. I was actually surprised at the time that Santa Monica added this in the reboot, even if it's completely obvious now in retrospect, since it was such a famous callback. Kratos comes back to the family cabin and adds the Blades of Chaos back into his repertoire. This was the first part of the game that actually gave me chills, because it was such a well-paced cutscene showing Kratos' acceptance that he can no longer be reluctant about using his old weapons in the face of the more powerful Norse gods, and he couldn't hide his past from his son anymore. And moreover, I was just finally glad to get some kind of weapon that could outclass that stupid axe that was holding me back throughout the first half. And yes, the Blades of Chaos act exactly how they did from back in the day. You get the wide swinging arcs that can control the entire area around you, and a couple punishing targeted attacks that allow the player to dish out crushing blows to specific enemies. It's actually a multifaceted weapon, and I was delighted to get them back. And this whole moment is just capitalized on perfectly when the ghost of Athena shows up in the game to remind Kratos of his trail of brutality in Olympus, and again to highlight what this moment actually means for the character of Kratos to begin using the blades again, because of how stained with murder they are in what they actually literally mean to Kratos himself. With these in tow, they can finally start moving to the Giants' realm. With Kratos' past starting to unravel and Atreus getting the stories from Kratos later on, Atreus begins to change as well, having found out that Kratos is a part of the gods and therefore he has some immortality. Kratos tries to teach him the dire seriousness of the life of a god and how awful gods can actually be, but as a petulant 12-year-old and being annoyed at Kratos' lack of telling him anything up to this point, Atreus begins to act out towards Kratos and others around him, developing those terrible traits that Kratos was trying to sway Atreus against. This leads to a breaking point at one point where Atreus brutally murders the wrong person. Kratos tries to stop him, and in a struggle between the the two, Atreus accidentally flings them into another realm that they should never have gone to, and now they need to waste time finding the path back without anybody realizing that they came to that place. Another series of puzzles ensues in that realm that they've never been to before, leading them closer and closer to the ire of the gods. The ire coming in the form of Baldur, who has decided to toy with them when they meet another time. This resentment isn't just because Kratos killed most of Olympus, but also that he has his own personal problems. After a couple of scenes with him, Kratos eventually finds out that Baldur is literally invincible, having been inscribed with these magical tattoos that allow him to be completely unfeeling. That is true for damage and for pleasure. His inability to feel truly human makes him resent his mother, who decided to do that to him at one point when he was a kid. After escaping from the Forbidden Realm, the pair returns to Midgard in order to resume finding their path to the Giant's realm. Now that the game is starting to feel like the end game, the pair meet up with the Lady of the Woods another time. This time, she spills the beans a bit more and tells Kratos that she's actually Freya, Baldur's mother. She shares that she had the best of intentions while cursing her son and wants to make amends for his hatred of her. She still loves Baldur quite a bit for someone who's put out a revenge quest against her specifically. I don't really understand where Freya's coming on this. I understand the whole motherly love conquers all thing, but I don't understand it in the face of a son that is actively trying to kill her. I'd think that self-preservation would be more important at that point, especially since the murderous son is invincible and she's been stripped of all of her godly powers. It doesn't make a lot of sense that she still wants to protect Baldur at all costs, even if he would be strangling her at that point in time. This test actually comes pretty quickly after Kratos deals with the sea monster another time, because Baldur returns to Midgard to fight Kratos a final time, only to find Freya with him, getting the chance that he's been searching for an untold amount of years. Naturally, Kratos gets in between the two in order to protect Freya and try to put Baldur in the ground. Similarly to their first appearance, the final battle with Baldur combines all of the cinematic angles, QTEs, and challenging combat sections together to make another earth-shattering boss battle that blows the other boring encounters out of the water. It is a fast-paced, brilliant, challenging, and long enough to be completely satisfying to the player combat section. A true spectacle in every sense of the word, and a true reason to actually get a PS4 at any time. Now that Baldur has been worn down, Atreus jumps in since the pair were able to find the secret of removing Baldur's invincibility, granting him something he inadvertently actually wanted: death. A death that, for some reason, Freya puts on Kratos' conscience, doing a 180 and threatening him with as much devastation as she can rain down on him for killing her son using magic acquired from her knowledge. Again, this is kind of extremely weird, since before the battle, Freya was literally about to die in Baldur's hands. So I don't really get why she's being so mad at Kratos. Somehow she would have been easily more accepting of Baldur's murder of her rather than Kratos murdering Baldur, even though she's now alive. With that bridge completely napalmed, Kratos and Atreus can finally finish their actual journey, after all this bullshit nonsense, gaining access to the Giant's realm through the final portal and reaching a truly devastated world. The Giant's realm is extremely small because the developer wanted to bring across the annihilation of the Giants by Odin's family in their previous war. Now the Giants that remain are few and they're scattered across the other realms. Surprisingly, when they reach the peak, they find a huge mural dedicated to Kratos' journey? Apparently, Atreus' mother could see into the future and inscribe their entire journey to the mountain for when they'd arrive there. Somehow, Mom had this all worked out exactly as it happened now. Through the mural, Atreus finds out that he's actually Loki in the realm of the gods, but was renamed by Kratos for a friend of his that died in battle. Then the pair scatter Mom's ashes and the credits roll. Yeah, that's the end of the game. Another big sign that God of War has truly changed in its second trilogy. In every other God of War game, the game would end on a bombastic final battle, but amazingly, the battle with Baldur was the final boss, and this game decided to end on a story moment, which is commendable for how much Santa Monica believed in the plot of this game, its best feature. They rebooted God of War to be story-driven rather than gameplay-driven. I'm not sure what it's going to look like, but the middle game is going to bring Ragnarok to Midgard, and a huge battle between Kratos and the more famous members of Odin's family, maybe Odin himself, is going to happen, along with probably that battle that we're going to have to kill Freya in because she decided that that's going to be the case. And she's probably going to acquire her full suite of godly powers before that happens because drama's got a drama. Kratos and Atreus are going to have their hands full in that one. For how well known God of War 2018 was for its well-written story, great characters, and interesting world of puzzles and smackdowns, it seemed like the game was more notable for what it didn't include than what it did, since it was able to do this 20-25 hour long single-player linear storyline about a quest of family remembrance without having 7 versions at launch, a huge shop full of costumes and boosters. I don't even think this game had a season pass or story DLC to purchase. It was a fully developed AAA game without the nonsense that usually accompanies those releases, and so the game became a sticking point to pundits who were arguing against the ideas that somehow those additional revenues were required for the industry to continue working. It was a champion on that ground, but after going through the actual game itself, it's definitely not perfect by any means that everybody thought it was at launch. The game is still fantastic, don't get me wrong, but it has core issues. The failing double act between Kratos and Atreus hurts the narrative strength of the game. The combat's trying to do way too many things at once and makes the first half of the game's combat way more annoying than it needed to be. And the open world elements are trivial even at the best of times. So just like with the monetization, maybe Santa Monica could have focused the entire development down to what it was actually good at. Shoving all this ancillary development effort into the main story so that you could get it more done, maybe have another realm, another boss fight or two, maybe another huge puzzle section instead of the lacking side quests, maybe a bit more time to write meaningful Atreus dialogue. I thoroughly enjoyed the game, and it remains committed to the spirit of God of War and redefining Kratos' character while also being completely different from anything else in the series. Kratos should not go on another drawn-out revenge quest because that'll just reinforce his old unhealthy character rather than building on the developing family man that he is now, raising his son throughout the horrors of fighting the Odin's family. I'm hoping to see that they do more with the father-son dynamic when the two become stronger now that they have to face this bigger threat in the sequel when it comes out on the PS5, because here in the reboot, it's entirely lacking, which is a real shame because it would have been one of the game's biggest strengths. It's something completely unique that only this game could have done. It's pretty rare to actually get a parent-kid game. Okay, it just doesn't happen every day. But Santa Monica does deliver another powerful game, another must-have for the library, and I hope to see the next one when it eventually releases. I'll leave you all now with a final scoreboard. And wish you all out there a victory for gamers. And thank you for watching. Have a good night.